I still remember the exact moment my life turned upside down. It wasn't dramatic. No screaming, no broken dishes. Just my Uncle Frank leaning back in his chair at my parents' dining room table, twirling his fork through Mom's spaghetti, and saying those words that would haunt me for the next 2 years. "You're wasting that big place alone, Owen. Let me rent it out for you. We'll split the profit." The March evening was warm for Riverside standards, and Mom had opened all the windows in their small ranch house. The smell of garlic bread mixed with the jasmine blooming outside, creating that perfect Sunday dinner atmosphere that had defined my childhood. Dad sat at the head of the table in his usual spot, still wearing his work shirt from the construction company despite Mom's protests about nice clothes for family dinner. My sister Emma was texting under the table, thinking nobody noticed. Aunt Diane picked at her salad, making those little sounds she always made when she wanted to seem engaged but wasn't really listening. And there was Uncle Frank, 52 years old, perpetually tanned from whatever outdoor scheme he was running that month, with that easy smile that had been charming people out of their better judgment for decades. He had this way of making everything sound reasonable, even when it absolutely wasn't. "I mean, seriously," Frank continued, gesturing with his fork toward me. "You're moving to San Francisco with Sophia, right? That's what, 400 miles? You really want to deal with tenant calls from that far away?" I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. At 26, I still felt like a kid at these family dinners, especially when Frank started giving advice. "I was thinking of hiring a property management company," I said, cutting my meatball into smaller pieces than necessary. "They charge about 10%, but..." "10%?" Frank laughed, the sound filling the small dining room. "Owen, that's $320 a month you're just throwing away. For what? Some stranger to cash checks and call plumbers? I could do that with my eyes closed." Dad nodded enthusiastically, his weathered hands wrapped around his beer bottle. "Frank's got a point, son. Why pay some company when you've got family willing to help?" I glanced at Mom, who was unusually quiet. She was pushing food around her plate, that little crease between her eyebrows that appeared whenever she was thinking hard about something. Emma looked up from her phone long enough to roll her eyes. She'd never been impressed by Uncle Frank's schemes. "What exactly are you thinking?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The truth was, I was terrified of being a long-distance landlord. I'd bought the 4-bedroom house in Riverside 2 years earlier, when I was 24 and convinced I was some kind of real estate genius. The mortgage was $2,000 a month, plus another $600 for property taxes and insurance. I'd been living there, renting out the spare bedrooms to cover most of the costs. But now that my job had gone fully remote and Sophia had gotten that amazing opportunity in San Francisco, the whole arrangement needed to change. Frank leaned forward, his eyes lighting up with that entrepreneurial gleam I'd seen 100 times before. "Here's what I'm thinking. You rent it out for what? $3,200? $3,400? The realtor said I could probably get $3,400, maybe $36 if I found the right tenants," I admitted. "Perfect. So after your mortgage and costs, you're looking at about $700 in profit, right?" Frank was already calculating in his head, the same way he'd calculated the potential returns on his failed food truck, his abandoned landscaping business, and that disastrous attempt at flipping houses that had ended with him owing Dad $12,000. "About that, yeah. So here's the deal. I handle everything, and I mean everything. Finding tenants, running background checks, showing the place, collecting rent, dealing with maintenance issues, late-night emergencies. You literally do nothing except cash checks. We split the profit 50-50. You get $350 a month for zero work, I get $350 for doing all the heavy lifting. Win-win." The room went quiet except for the sound of Emma's texting and the distant hum of the neighbor's lawnmower. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my response. The offer sounded reasonable on the surface. Property managers typically charge 10 to 12%, and Frank was essentially offering to do it for 50% of the profit, which worked out to about the same rate. Plus, he was family. 50-50 seems a little high for management, I said carefully, not wanting to offend him but also trying to protect my interests. Frank's expression shifted slightly, just for a second, before the smile returned. "Owen, you're thinking like someone who's never actually managed a rental property. It's not just collecting rent. I'll be doing credit checks, calling references, coordinating repairs, dealing with complaints from neighbors. Normal property management companies charge 10%, but they're managing dozens of properties. For one property, they're basically stealing from you. I'm offering to do it for family rates because you're my nephew. Dad jumped in again. Frank managed Joe Martinelli's place a few years back. Did a great job. I helped Joe find a tenant, Emma interjected, still looking at her phone. Once. That's not exactly property management. Frank waved his hand dismissively. Details. The point is, I know how to handle these things. And Owen, let's be honest. You're going to be busy with your new life in San Francisco. New job, planning a future with Sophia. You really want to spend your weekends driving down here to deal with broken air conditioners and late rent payments? He had a point. My new position at the tech company was demanding, and Sophia and I were already talking about engagement. The last thing I wanted was to be tied down with landlord responsibilities from 400 miles away. What would the arrangement look like exactly? I asked. Simple. I find the tenants, get them moved in, collect the rent, handle any issues that come up. First of each month I send you your half. Easy as that. Frank's smile widened. We're family, Owen. We don't need a bunch of complicated paperwork and contracts. We shake hands, and we're good. That should have been my first red flag. Mom must have thought the same thing because she finally spoke up. Frank, don't you think you should put something in writing? Just to make sure everyone's clear on the expectations? Frank looked at her like she'd suggested we all sign our dinner conversation in triplicate. Angela, come on. We're family. What am I going to do? Steal from my own nephew? Owen knows he can trust me. The pressure in the room was palpable. Dad was nodding along enthusiastically, clearly thinking this was a great solution. Aunt Diane was making supportive noises. Even Emma had stopped texting and was watching to see what I'd say. Only Mom looked concerned, but she wasn't pushing the issue. I thought about my options. Hiring a property management company meant giving up 10% of the gross rent, plus dealing with a faceless corporation. Frank was offering to do it for what amounted to the same rate, and he was family. If something went wrong, I could always change the arrangement. Okay, I heard myself saying. Let's try it. Frank's face lit up like he'd just won the lottery. Fantastic. This is going to work out great for both of us, Owen. You'll see. Dad raised his beer bottle. To family, helping family. Everyone toasted except Mom, who managed only a weak smile and a small sip of her wine. I should have paid more attention to that reaction. I should have asked more questions. I should have insisted on a written contract, despite Frank's dismissal of paperwork. But I didn't. I was 26, successful, and convinced I was making a smart business decision with someone I trusted. After all, what could possibly go wrong with a simple family arrangement? As it turned out, everything. The next morning hit me like a freight train carrying legal documents and family dysfunction. I sat in Richard Horvath's office at exactly 9 a.m., clutching a manila folder containing every scrap of evidence I could find. My hands were still shaking from the phone call yesterday. 3 months without rent, Frank signing leases as the owner, possible fraud charges. The words kept echoing in my head like a broken record player stuck on the worst song imaginable. Richard's office smelled like old leather and expensive coffee, the kind of place where serious conversations happened and lives got turned upside down. The mahogany desk between us felt like a courtroom bench, and I was definitely the plaintiff who'd just discovered he'd been living in a legal nightmare for over a year. Let's start from the beginning, Richard said, adjusting his glasses and opening a yellow legal pad. Walk me through exactly what Frank told you at that family dinner. I took a deep breath, tasting the metallic flavor of anxiety on my tongue. He said he'd handle everything. Find tenants, collect rent, deal with maintenance. We'd split the profit 50-50 because he was doing all the work. Dad thought it was a great idea, and I paused, feeling the weight of my own naivety. I trusted him because he's family. And there was no written agreement? Mom asked about a contract. Frank said family doesn't need paperwork. The words felt bitter coming out of my mouth now, like spoiled milk I should have spit out immediately. Richard made a note, his pen scratching against the paper with the sound of impending doom. Show me what you have. I spread out my pathetic collection of evidence across his desk. Venmo payments from Frank, each one exactly $350 with the same emoji-filled caption, "Your half and house emoji." Screenshot after screenshot of the same amount, month after month, like breadcrumbs leading to a gingerbread house made of lies. 15 payments, I said, counting them again even though I'd memorized the number. Then nothing for 3 months. He told me the tenants were having temporary issues, and payments would be a week late. That was 12 weeks ago. Richard pulled out a calculator and started punching numbers. The clicking sounds filled the silence like a countdown timer. $5,250 total you received over 15 months. If the rent was $3,400 initially, minus your mortgage and costs of roughly $2,700, that's $700 profit monthly. Your half should have been $350. He looked up at me. But Frank told me yesterday the rent is now $3,800. My stomach dropped like I was on a roller coaster designed by someone who hated happiness. He raised the rent without telling me? Gets worse. Richard pulled out a folder I hadn't seen before. I did some digging yesterday after our call. Public records, county databases, the works. He slid a document across the desk. This is the lease Frank signed with the Pattersons. I stared at the paper, my eyes focusing on one line that made my blood pressure spike. Property owner, Frank Castellano. He signed it as the owner, I whispered, the words barely escaping my throat. Not just that. Look at the rent amount. My eyes scanned down to find the monthly payment, $3,600. Not the $3,400 he'd told me, not even the $3,800 Richard had mentioned. I felt like I was reading my own obituary written in rental agreements and family betrayal. So he lied about the original rent amount, raised it again without telling me, and signed the lease claiming he owned my property. I looked up at Richard, hoping he'd tell me this was all some elaborate misunderstanding. Please tell me there's a reasonable explanation for this. Richard's expression was the legal equivalent of a doctor about to deliver terminal diagnosis news. Owen, your uncle has been operating this property as if he owns it. He's collected approximately $57,000 in rent over 15 months and given you less than 10% of that. I did the math in my head, my engineering brain automatically calculating the theft even as my heart tried to reject the numbers. If the rent averaged $3,700 over 15 months, that's $55,500. Minus my mortgage and costs of $4,500, the profit was $15,000. My half should have been $7,500, not the $5,250 I received. He stole over $2,000 from me, I said, the number feeling both too small and impossibly large. My own uncle. Actually, it's worse than that. Richard pulled out another document. I found the lease renewal Frank signed 6 months ago. He raised the rent to $3,800 and extended the lease for another year, without your knowledge or consent. The room started spinning slightly, like I was drunk on family dysfunction and legal complications. Can he do that? I mean, legally, is that lease valid? That's the million-dollar question, literally. Richard leaned back in his chair, which creaked like old bones under pressure. Frank had no legal authority to sign anything on your behalf. No power of attorney, no written property management agreement, no license to manage property in California. The lease might be completely unenforceable. What does that mean for the tenants? If the lease is invalid, they might be considered month-to-month tenants under California law, or they might have grounds to argue they're not obligated to pay rent at all because they were misled about who they were dealing with. Richard's pen tapped against the desk like a metronome counting down to disaster. This could get very complicated very quickly. I felt like I was drowning in a pool filled with legal jargon and family betrayal. So Frank created a mess that could cost me thousands in legal fees, lost rent, and potential lawsuits, all while stealing money from me for over a year. That's a fair summary. Richard closed the folder with a sound like a judge's gavel. The question now is what you want to do about it. I stared out his office window at the San Francisco skyline, watching people walk by on the street below, living their normal lives with their non-criminal uncles and straightforward rental properties. The fog was rolling in from the bay, gray and thick like my mood. What are my options? Criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement, civil lawsuit for the money he stole plus damages, or we send a demand letter and see if he cooperates." Richard's voice was calm and professional, like we were discussing lunch plans instead of family destruction. "I should warn you, though, going after family members legally tends to create permanent rifts." I laughed, but it came out bitter and sharp. He already created the rift when he decided to steal from me. I just didn't know about it yet. Richard nodded approvingly. "Good attitude. Victims often blame themselves or try to protect the people who hurt them. You're thinking clearly." "Send the letter," I said without hesitation. "I want my money back, and I want him to understand there are consequences for this kind of behavior. If he'd stolen from a stranger, he'd be in jail. Family doesn't make it okay. I'll draft something today and have it delivered tomorrow." Richard made another note. "We'll give him 14 days to pay full restitution and provide all documentation. If he refuses or tries to negotiate, we file both criminal and civil charges." I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with sadness, like finally admitting a relationship was over after months of pretending everything was fine. "How much money are we talking about?" Richard pulled out his calculator again. "Conservatively, he owes you $4,750 in rent money he kept, plus interest, plus the cost of legal fees and potential eviction proceedings. Call it $6,000 to start. If we find more evidence of wrongdoing, that number could go up. And the tenants? We'll have to start the eviction process from scratch, properly this time, with you as the actual owner, following all legal procedures. It'll take 60 to 90 days minimum, assuming they don't fight it or claim the lease was invalid." I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache building like storm clouds on a sunny day. This is going to destroy my relationship with my dad's side of the family. "Probably," Richard agreed, with the bedside manner of a surgeon explaining amputation. "But consider this. Frank destroyed the relationship when he decided to steal from you. You're just refusing to pretend it didn't happen." The truth of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Frank had been lying to my face for over a year, taking money that belonged to me, signing legal documents in my name, and probably sleeping soundly every night while doing it. I'd been worried about preserving family relationships while he'd been systematically betraying the trust I'd given him. "Draft the letter," I said again, this time with more conviction. "And Richard, make it clear that this isn't a negotiation. He pays back what he stole, or he faces the consequences. Family discount is officially revoked." The phone call with Richard Horvath left me sitting in my San Francisco office, staring at my computer screen like it had just delivered news of an alien invasion. My hands were actually shaking as I scrolled through my Venmo history, counting those neat little $350 payments that had arrived like clockwork for months. Your half and house emoji, yet again. That stupid house emoji that had seemed so innocent, so family-friendly. Now it looked like a mockery. I called Sophia immediately. She was in a client meeting, but I texted her, "Emergency, call me ASAP." The three dots appeared and disappeared several times before she finally responded, "On my way." While I waited, I did what any millennial does in crisis. I Googled everything. Property management fraud California. Signing lease without authorization. Family member stealing rent money. The search results painted an increasingly grim picture. Forum after forum of people describing similar situations, most ending with destroyed families and criminal charges. My phone buzzed. "Sophia. What's wrong? You sound panicked." "I think Uncle Frank has been stealing from me for over a year." Silence. Then, "What do you mean stealing?" I explained the whole thing. The verbal agreement, the missing lease, the lawyer's call, the realization about the rent increases. As I spoke, I could hear her sharp intake of breath. "Owen, honey, how much money are we talking about?" I did the math out loud. If he raised it to $3,800 and was still only giving me $350, that's $800 a month he was keeping. Times 15 months, that's $12,000. $12,000? Her voice pitched higher. "Owen, that's not a mistake. That's systematic theft." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my office. The San Francisco skyline glittered outside my window. All those lights representing dreams and ambitions and people working toward their futures. I'd been so focused on building my life here, on my promotion, on planning our wedding, that I'd completely ignored what was happening 400 miles away. The worst part wasn't even the money, though 12 grand was no joke on a software engineer's salary. It was the betrayal. Uncle Frank had looked me in the eye at family dinners, asked about my job, congratulated me on my engagement, all while systematically stealing from me. Every month, he'd sent that Venmo payment with that cheerful emoji, knowing he was keeping twice as much for himself. I thought about calling my dad, but Richard's warning echoed in my head. Don't talk to Frank until we've met. Did that extend to Dad? Probably not, but I needed to process this first. I needed to understand the full scope of what had happened before I brought the family drama into it. That night, I barely slept. Sophia held me as I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing through every interaction with Frank over the past year. Had there been signs? Had he seemed nervous? Had he avoided talking about the property? Actually, now that I thought about it, he had been weird about details. Whenever I'd asked about the lease or the tenants, he'd been vague. They're good people, he'd say. No problems. When I'd mentioned wanting to drive down and see the place, he'd discouraged it. Why waste a weekend? Everything's handled. Everything's handled. God, what an understatement. The next morning I called in sick to work, something I'd done maybe 3 times in my entire career. I drove to Richard's office in downtown San Francisco, my stomach churning with each mile. The building was one of those imposing glass towers that screamed serious legal consequences, and I felt like I was walking into a courtroom already. Richard Horvath was exactly what you'd expect from a family business lawyer. Mid-60s, silver hair, the kind of steady presence that suggested he'd seen every possible way people could screw each other over. His office smelled like leather and old coffee, with law books lining every wall. "Owen," he said, standing to shake my hand. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." He'd already pulled the relevant documents. The lease was the first shock. Seeing Frank's signature on a line labeled "Property Owner, Frank Castellano" made my stomach drop. My address, my property, but his name claiming ownership. "This is fraud," Richard said simply. "In California, representing yourself as the owner of property you don't own is a felony. Your uncle didn't just cross a line, he obliterated it." He showed me the property deed next. My name in official black ink, purchased 2 years ago. Then he pulled up California property management law on his computer. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the screen. "Anyone managing rental property for someone else needs either a real estate license or a written property management agreement. Your uncle has neither. He's been operating illegally from day one." The numbers were even worse than I'd calculated. Richard had somehow obtained rent records. Apparently, Frank had raised the rent twice, first to $3,600, then to $3,800. Over 15 months, he'd collected $55,400 in rent and given me only $5,250. $50,000, I whispered. He stole $50,000. "Well, not quite," Richard corrected. "Your mortgage and expenses are about $2,700 monthly, so the actual profit was around $16,500 over 15 months. But you were entitled to half of that, $8,250. You received $5,250. So he owes you about $3,000 in unpaid profit sharing, plus whatever extra he collected by raising rents without authorization." I stared at the numbers. Even the smaller amount felt enormous. $3,000 was a vacation, a car repair, a chunk of wedding expenses. And the unauthorized rent increases? That was pure theft. "What are my options?" I asked. Richard leaned back in his chair. "Legally? You could have him arrested tomorrow. Fraud, embezzlement, operating without a license. The DA would love this case. It's clean, well documented, and your uncle essentially confessed when he called me." "And civilly?" "Sue for the money, plus damages, plus legal fees. You'd win easily." I thought about Frank's panicked voice on the phone yesterday, begging Richard to help him evict tenants from a property he'd been pretending to own. What about the tenants? Are they screwed? "That's complicated," Richard admitted. "They signed a lease with someone who claimed to own the property but doesn't. Legally, their lease might be void. But they've been paying rent in good faith, so they have some protections. We'd need to start over, notify them of the ownership change, offer them a new lease, then begin proper eviction proceedings if they won't pay." "How long will that take?" 60 to 90 days minimum, and that's assuming they cooperate. I rubbed my temples. So Frank's incompetence is going to cost me months of lost rent. Exactly, which is another item for the damages calculation. Richard pulled out a legal pad and started writing. Here's what I recommend. We send Frank a formal demand letter. Full restitution, plus costs, plus an admission of wrongdoing. Give him 14 days to comply. If he refuses, we file both criminal and civil actions. Will that destroy him? Richard looked at me seriously. Owen, your uncle destroyed himself when he chose to commit fraud. You're just deciding whether to document it officially. That afternoon, I finally called my dad. I was dreading it. Vincent Castellano was a loyal brother, the kind of man who'd bail Frank out of jail without asking questions. But I couldn't move forward without telling him. Owen, how's work? How's Sophia? Dad, we need to talk about Uncle Frank and the rental property. The line went quiet. What about it? I told him everything. The fake lease, the stolen money, the lawyer's assessment. With each detail, the silence on the other end grew heavier. Finally, Dad spoke. He signed the lease as the owner? Yes. Of your property? Yes. And he's been keeping extra rent money? For over a year. Another long pause. Then, son of a bitch. I'd never heard my father curse about his brother before. Ever. Dad, I'm sorry. I know this puts you in a terrible position. Owen, stop. This doesn't put me anywhere. Frank put himself in this position, and he dragged you into it. His voice was getting harder. I pushed you to trust him. I vouched for him. This is partially my fault. You couldn't have known. I should have known. Frank's always had schemes, always cutting corners. But I thought family was different. I thought he'd never steal from my son. The pain in his voice was worse than my own anger. My dad was realizing his brother wasn't who he thought he was, and it was breaking his heart. What are you going to do? He asked. My lawyer wants to send a demand letter. Give Frank 14 days to pay back what he stole. And if he doesn't? Criminal charges, civil lawsuit, the whole thing. Dad was quiet for a long time. You know what, Owen? Do it. Frank made his choices. Now he gets to live with the consequences. That night, Richard sent the demand letter. 14 days to produce $11,750 and sign a confession of wrongdoing, or face criminal and civil prosecution. No negotiation, no family discounts. I forwarded a copy to my dad, and he forwarded it to Frank. My phone started ringing within an hour. 6 months later, I was sitting in my San Francisco apartment when my phone rang. Dad's name on the screen. Owen, we need to talk about Christmas. I knew what this was about. Every year, the entire Castellano family gathered at my parents' house. Aunts, uncles, cousins, the whole circus. And every year, Uncle Frank held court like some kind of patriarch, telling stories and acting like everyone's favorite uncle. Let me guess, I said. Frank's asking if things can go back to normal. He's been calling your mother every week, says he's paid you back, learned his lesson, wants to make amends. I walked to my window, looking out at the Bay Area skyline. Down there, people were living their lives, trusting their families, making handshake deals. Most of them probably never got burned like I did. Dad, he stole $12,000 from me, over 15 months. He looked me in the eye at every family dinner and smiled while he was stealing from me. I know, son, but it's been 6 months. He did pay you back. He paid me back because Richard threatened him with criminal charges, not because he felt guilty, because he got caught. There was silence on the other end. I could hear Mom in the background, probably making her Sunday sauce. Some things never changed. Your mother thinks we should give him a chance. Mom always thinks we should give people chances. Remember when Cousin Tony kept borrowing money and never paying it back? She defended him for years until he stole from Grandma's purse at her funeral. This is different. Is it? Frank has been running schemes my entire life. Remember his restaurant investment that turned out to be a food truck he bought with other people's money? Or his consulting business that was just him taking credit for other people's work? I heard Dad sigh. The kind of sigh that meant he knew I was right but didn't want to admit it. He's my brother, Owen. And I'm your son. When you have to choose between your son who got robbed and your brother who did the robbing, that should be an easy choice. Another long silence. I could picture Dad in his workshop, probably holding his phone with one hand and running the other through his graying hair. He'd been doing that gesture since I was a kid. What do you want me to tell him? Tell him the truth, that actions have consequences, that some bridges once burned don't get rebuilt. So you won't come to Christmas if he's there? I thought about it. All those years of family Christmases, Grandma's cookies, the kids running around, everyone arguing about football games. Frank always there, always the center of attention, always working some angle. I'll come to Christmas, I said finally. But if Frank's there, I'm leaving. I won't sit at the same table as someone who stole from me. I won't pretend everything's fine for the sake of family peace. Owen, Dad, listen to me. Really listen. Frank didn't just steal money. He stole my trust. He made me question every family relationship I have. Every time someone offers to help me now, I wonder what their angle is. Every time someone says, we're family, we don't need contracts, I remember Frank saying those exact words. I walked back to my couch where Sophia was reading a book. She looked up and gave me a supportive smile. She'd been through this whole mess with me, had seen how it affected me. He changed me, Dad, and not in a good way. I used to trust people at their word. Now I get everything in writing. I used to think family was different from business. Now I know better. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, Dad said quietly. Maybe not. But I didn't choose to learn that lesson. Frank forced it on me. We talked for another 20 minutes. Dad told me about work, about Mom's garden, about my sister Emma's new job. Normal family stuff. But underneath it all was this tension, this unresolved thing that Frank had created. 2 weeks before Christmas, Mom called. We're having Christmas without Frank, she said without preamble. What happened? Your father and I talked, a lot, and we realized something. Frank has been causing problems in this family for years, small ones mostly. But this thing with you, it opened our eyes. I sat up straighter. This wasn't what I'd expected. We started thinking about all the times Frank had borrowed money and never paid it back. All the schemes he'd gotten other family members involved in. All the times we'd made excuses for him. Mom, let me finish. Last week, your cousin Jessica called. Remember how Frank helped her with her taxes 3 years ago? Turns out he claimed some of her deductions on his own return. She just found out when she got audited. My stomach dropped. Are you serious? Dead serious. And that's not all. Your Aunt Maria told me Frank convinced her to invest in some cryptocurrency thing last year. $5,000. Gone. I rubbed my forehead. This was bigger than just me. How many people has he screwed over? We're still finding out, but your father made a decision. Frank's not welcome at family events anymore. Not until he makes things right with everyone he's hurt. I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not satisfaction exactly. Relief. How's Dad handling it? Better than I thought. You know what he said? He said he should have stopped making excuses for Frank years ago. That by protecting Frank from consequences, he enabled him to hurt other people. Christmas morning, I drove down to my parents' house. The driveway was full of cars, but Frank's beat-up Honda wasn't among them. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and coffee. Kids were running around with new toys. Everyone was talking and laughing. But there was something different in the air. A lightness I hadn't felt at family gatherings in years. Cousin Jessica came up to me while I was getting coffee. I heard what Frank did to you, she said quietly. Yeah, I heard about your tax situation too. She nodded. I wanted to thank you. For what? For standing up to him. For not just letting it go. If you hadn't pushed back, I never would have found out about my taxes, and Aunt Maria wouldn't have realized she'd been scammed. I looked around the room. Uncle Frank's absence was noticeable, but not in a bad way. It was like when you finally fix a squeaky hinge. You don't realize how much the noise was bothering you until it stops. I didn't do it for everyone else, I said. I did it for me. I know, but it helped all of us. Later, while we were eating dinner, Dad stood up to make his usual Christmas toast. Every year, he'd talk about family, about being grateful for each other, about sticking together through thick and thin. This year was different. "I want to talk about trust," he said, raising his glass. "Real trust. The kind that's earned and maintained through actions, not just words." He looked directly at me. This year, our family learned some hard lessons about the difference between loyalty and enabling, about the difference between forgiveness and accountability. The room got quiet. Even the kids seemed to sense this was important. We learned that sometimes protecting someone from consequences isn't love. It's just postponing the inevitable. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the results of their choices. He raised his glass higher. "To the family members who have integrity, who keep their word, who earn trust instead of demanding it. And to my son Owen, who taught us all what it means to stand up for yourself, even when it's hard." Everyone raised their glasses. Even my little nephew, who didn't understand what was happening but wanted to be part of it. As we drank, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Frank never did show up that day. According to Dad, he'd called that morning, asking if he could just stop by for a few minutes. Dad told him no. Firmly. 3 months later, I got a text from Frank. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know I'm in therapy, trying to figure out why I do the things I do. I'm sorry for what I put you through." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I deleted it without responding. Some people might think that was harsh, but I'd learned something important over the past year. Forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. You can forgive someone for your own peace of mind while still protecting yourself from future harm. Frank's apology might have been genuine. His therapy might be helping. But that didn't erase 15 months of theft. It didn't rebuild the trust he'd shattered. It didn't undo the lesson he'd taught me about the importance of getting everything in writing, even with family, especially with family. The Riverside house eventually sold. I decided I didn't want to be a long-distance landlord anymore, and the whole experience had soured me on rental properties. I used the profit to put a down payment on a place with Sophia in San Francisco. Every time I sign a contract now, I think about that Sunday dinner where Frank convinced me to trust him with my property. How easily I'd said, "I trust Uncle Frank," when Mom asked about putting it in writing. I'll never make that mistake again.